Wade Franson is the host of Created in the Image of God, a series that examines the role of religion in society, from messianic returns to the emotive responses transmitted through our culture. Wade fearlessly addresses reality claims from all directions, objectively exploring their compatibility with Holy Scripture. Tonight's episode, The Jesus I Never Knew, with Philip Yancey.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Created in the Image of God. I'm your host, Wade Franson, and I could not be more excited and honored today to have a very distinguished guest on this show. Philip Yancey is the author of, I don't even know how many books, but I do know that he has sold over 15 million of them. What a great pleasure it is to have you in the studio, Philip, and welcome to Created in the Image of God.
Thank you very much, Wade.
Do you have a count of how many of those books are that you've published?
I say about 25.
About 25.
You know, they're kind of my children, and some of them turn out better than others, and some of them I just as soon forget about, but there they
are. Well, some of them may have disappointed you a little bit, but you still love them.
Absolutely.
And are any of them what you would consider grandchildren, books that were like secondary, coming from, you know, the genesis of the idea of the first one?
Absolutely. I tend to write about two themes, particularly the theme of suffering, why bad things happen, and the theme of grace. And each of those has found different incarnations. The first book I wrote was a book called Where is God When It Hurts? And later I wrote a book called Disappointment with God, which is a bit of a sequel to that. And then much later, a book called The Question That Never Goes Away, because it's a question that never goes away. And often those books come about because people write me letters in response to a previous book, and they say, well, what about this? Or what about my situation? And you didn't deal with this. And I think, you're right. I should write another book about it.
Amazing. And we will get into, I love that, the sort of juxtaposition of suffering and grace. We'll get into that. But as our guests, as our audience knows, we have a sort of a standard format, the show being called Created in the Image of God, the role of religion in society. We like to start with our guest's origin story. And we'd like you to go way back to your pre-existence, actually. So who were your parents? Where did they come from? And how and why did you come to be planted where and when you were planted on this planet?
Ooh, a long time ago on a planet far, far away. It all began. No, it's a good question. I recently wrote a memoir called Where the Light Fell. That is my origin story. And as I wrote that, I realized that one of the most significant facts about my life occurred before I was conscious of it. And that was my father died of polio when I was just a year old. So I have no conscious memories of him.
Wow.
My brother was 3. He has a few memories, and that's it. The reason he died, Wade, he went from being a virile, he had just been in the war, was actually sailing to Asia when the truce, the atomic bombs fell on Japan, and the truce was declared, and they turned around, went back through the Panama Canal, and just kind of sat on the ship for the next 6 months, didn't do anything. And then he got married. He had a rather dramatic conversion while he was in the Navy to Christianity. He was at a rescue mission, actually, a famous one in Chicago called the Pacific Garden Mission. And then he got married to a woman, and they decided to be missionaries. So the next couple of years, they raised some support from people, and he worked on different jobs in an orphanage at different places. And then overnight, he was completely paralyzed. So he lay in an iron lung, one of these machines. He was so paralyzed, he couldn't even breathe on his own.
Was he in his 30s then at that time or?
No, he was 23 when he died.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah.
So he was already packing a lot of life into his short time, and then...
Correct. Yeah, wow. He was 20 when they got married, and then a year later they had my brother, and then 2 years later me. And so here was this man who was very extroverted and just wanted to be a missionary above all things. And suddenly he's paralyzed, and he's in a charity hospital. He's not getting good care at all. A group of people around him, including his wife, my mother, decided this is no life for him. Can't be God's will for him to die. And so against all medical advice, they had him removed from that iron lung. And for a couple of days, it looked like he was showing a bit of progress. Maybe he was able to move a toe that he hadn't been able to before. And then about a week later, he died.
Wow.
And that set the tone of my life. I told you I wrote this book called Disappointment with God. And I think that was my mother's case. I mean, imagine her. She had been moved from Philadelphia to a whole new place in the South in Atlanta, had planned to go to the mission field, had these two babies, a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old. And then she suddenly lost her husband, and she didn't know how to drive a car. She had never written a check. I mean, she just wasn't prepared for life. So that kind of guaranteed that we would be raised in poverty. I went to six different grammar schools in 6 years. And the reason is every time they raise the rent, often they'll get you in with a cheap rent, and then they raise it the next year. And every time they did that, she would find another cheap rent and move to the new place. So
creativity, problem solving, and willingness to somehow make it through with hard work and hard choices.
And she did that. We ended up in a trailer, one of these mobile homes, as they were called. It was a trailer, 8 feet wide, 48 feet long. I mean, I live in Colorado, and we see mobile trailers running down the highway bigger than that.
Right.
But this is where we lived, and it happened to be on the grounds of a church, fundamentalist church, that had been a pony farm. So I kind of liked it. There were a lot of insects to chase and a barn to explore.
And how old were you then, Philip?
That would have been early high school.
Okay. Well, I'm gonna interrupt here and share an anecdote.
Yeah.
Because we talked about Alaska earlier, and I shared with you that I was baptized in a horse trough in my ministry.
There you go.
That was at age 19, but at age 17, when I was between my junior and senior year in high school, my father moved out on a piece of property that he was clearing and building a house in, and he lived in a little trailer, probably maybe slightly smaller than the one. It was a travel trailer that your family was in, but there was no room for me, so I was living in a tent in Alaska. My senior year of high school for 10 months. And as you can do the math, these were consecutive months, right? So 20 below, and I'm living in a tent with no water and electricity. So my point is, I can really empathize with your situation, and I'm aware of how this shapes you and your thinking. And so when you were going through this suffering, and you mentioned that the bookends of your books were suffering and grace, and this is why we love to dive into those origin stories, to see where that focus comes from that one later devotes one's life to. And I'm sure I'm kind of getting close to hitting the nail on the head of some of the source of your questions of why.
Yeah. The story I told you about the people who loved my father but made a tragic mistake that ended up in his death. That taught me early on that not everyone who claims to speak for God does so.
Well, yes, and so when I was living in that tent, on one very cold late November day that was sort of in between snow and rain, I was so angry at my circumstances. I was extremely careless. I had this barrel stove I was living in an 8-man army tent at this point. I'd started in a pup tent during the summer. And my hands were freezing. Everything was wet, and I couldn't get this fire started. And I was using gasoline to start it. And I was getting angry and pouring, gas in, lighting it, and it would go out, gas in. And this time I poured a whole bunch of it in, and it had kind of gotten hot in there, and I could feel it sizzling. I could hear it sizzling, the gas. And I flipped a match in there, and the thing turned into a flamethrower right at my face. And I'm bald today, but not because of that. I had a hat on, but all my eyebrows and all my facial hair and about 2 layers of skin were completely burned off. And I went into the trailer, and my parents, being in that fundamentalist approach, they didn't want to go to doctors. You trusted in God. So I'm laying on this couch and in this little trailer, and they put plastic under me and snow on my face. The plastic was to not have the couch get wet from the melting snow. So I'm laying in melting snow water, burned in agony. And I had, I ran into the trailer. I dumped my whole head into this big bucket of freezing water that we had in the shower, which was the water that the family used on this property. A big trash can, rather, not a bucket, a big trash can full of water, because we had to go to town every couple of days and get water. So I pushed my head in there to stop the pain, laid on the couch for like an hour. And by now I'm in agony and I'm getting into hypothermia. But they still didn't take me to be treated at all. They took me to the minister's house in Anchorage, which was 40 minutes away, to be anointed for healing, right? And when I woke up in the morning, it was nice to be in a house and sleep in a bed. When I woke up in the morning, my eyes and my mouth, everything was sealed shut with pus. I couldn't open my eyes or my mouth. And, they got some kind of cream and ointment, but I never did go. Thankfully, it was just 2 or 3 layers of skin. So it was just absolute agony, but we never did go to a doctor. And, wow. I could go on and on about, but this is what you're experiencing or you're describing in terms of your father's situation, right? It was something like that, where they pulled the plug out of faith and trust in God.
Yeah.
And that trust was misplaced because of their heedlessness, not because of God's promises or God's, and that is a faith destroying moment for many, but not for you. Or it was maybe. So go on. I'll let you talk now. Sorry.
Well, that was the first of numerous things that I learned to. As you were telling that story, I flashed back to a day when this pony barn that I loved caught fire. We were in the church, which was one of these little concrete block buildings that seated maybe 125 people, and somebody yelled, and they rushed in the door and yelled, "Fire, fire!" We all ran outside, and sure enough, fire trucks came, and the pony barn was ablaze with fire everywhere. And I was thinking, well, but you're a kid, fire's pretty exciting, and you're a fireman there with hoses, and that's pretty great. And then I thought, plus, we don't have to go to church today. Wrong. So we all filed back into church, and the pastor preached a sermon on how the fires of hell are 7 times hotter than what you just observed out there. And that church also was a racist church. Just doctrinaire racist. It was Martin Luther King's birthday yesterday, and he was an Atlanta citizen. I was in Atlanta. But he was called from the pulpit Martin Lucifer Coon.
Oh, my goodness.
Oh,
my goodness. What year was this?
1965. Yeah. 64, 65.
So the fans of racial strife and hatred were burning hotter than that church across the nation at that time.
That's right. And so you go through a few of those, and you don't know what to believe. If the church lies to you about race or about healing, what about what they said about Jesus? What about what they said about the Bible? And you asked about my origin story. That set me on the career that I eventually became involved in. I became a writer, first a journalist for magazines, and then writing books. And for the last, 40 years, I've been able to pick up a question I don't know the answer to,
right,
and write a book about it.
Well, but along the way, as I know from having read a little bit and knowing the arc of your story in the memoir, along the way, you did experience what many would in those circumstances. You lost faith. Is that right? So
that is right.
Share a little bit about that, if you will, that valley. We go through peaks and valleys in life. Yeah.
Well, when you grow up in the church, and you would, I'm sure, understand this, you kind of learn how to rank. You learn how to climb the ladder, just like you go to the army and you learn, you treat the sergeant a certain way and a lieutenant, and things go your way. You're a rebel and they don't go your way. And it's like that in church. So I learned to pray prayers that would get a lot of people saying, yeah, amen, yeah. And I learned to give my testimony, and I learned to, throw the log into the fire at camp as I'm dedicating my life. I learned to do all these things. My mother usually was the kind of the director of the camp in terms of the program. So,
but when you did those things, were you in your own heart sincere? I mean, I know that sincerity is not absolute, right? But you could do those things in a cynical way, or you could do them in a sincere way, even though you know it's not 100% pure, because none of us are ever 100% pure.
Yeah. Well, I was kind of a Jekyll and Hyde, frankly, so because sometimes you can really feel sincere,
right,
and mean it with all your heart, but what does a 14-year-old heart know about life?
Right.
And the preachers are preaching against if you see a pretty girl and you turn around and look twice, that's lust. Well, come on now, these are teenagers.
Is it lust or appreciation?
Yeah, right. It's a good question. So some of the time I certainly was sincere, but then especially over the race issue, when I realized they were just flat out wrong.
Yeah.
And we're on the wrong side of most of the big issues in the 60s.
Right.
And so that was a critical time for me. And I just kind of put my faith in abeyance and decided I'll pick it up later. I don't know what to believe. So
you were disillusioned, but not yet rejecting.
Not fully rejecting. I mentioned I had a brother 2 years older, and he paved the way, a different way. Went to a Christian college, then dropped out the final semester, became one of Atlanta's original hippies, did a lot of LSD in Piedmont Park, and eventually kind of fried his brain. He was amazingly gifted musically, and he lost those gifts and became addicted to anything you can become addicted to. Alcohol, drugs, sex. And just watching him 2 years ahead of me, I realized that's not a healthy way to go. So I don't want to go that direction. And so it really was a several year period where I just I don't know what to believe, and I'm not going to make those choices right now. And then as I tell in my memoir, Where the Light Fell, I had a dramatic and unwelcome and uninvited conversion experience. It was
well, let's put a pin on that, and let's start the next segment with that. I'd like to go to a commercial break. We're seeing a couple of comments show up, and I want to encourage the audience to begin to comment. This first commercial break is actually a promotion for your book, Where the Light Fell, right? Is that the name of it?
Where the Light Fell, yes.
Where the Light Fell, right? It's your memoir, and it will go into much more depth on a lot of these issues. When we come back, I'd like to hear your conversion story and then go from there. So I'd like to encourage the audience, put your comments in the chat, because towards the end of the show, as our regular viewers know, we'll be inviting our guest, Philip Yancey, a celebrated author of a couple of dozen books, some of which he considers children, some of which we've just discovered maybe are grandchildren. And having sold over 15 million copies of them, if you're a fan and you want his latest one, or if you don't have any and you want to start, then put your comments in there, and we'll be giving away a free book to somebody as we get towards the end of the show. But right now, let's take a quick commercial break and look at what his memoir is all about. When we come back, we'll hear about that conversion story. Don't go anywhere. Stay tuned.
Philip Yancey's gripping memoir, Where the Light Fell, unravels his transformative journey from a strict southern USA upbringing to a life devoted to grace. Amidst a church portraying God as a stern enforcer, Yancey humorously labels himself in recovery from a toxic experience. Early encounters with contradictions led him to explore through books, challenging his upbringing and eventually questioning his faith. Yancey's return to faith unfolds gradually, marked by encounters with a world different from his teachings. Resonating with millions through bestsellers like Disappointment with God, his memoir reflects on this journey as a prequel, tracing his evolution from fundamentalism to a life dedicated to unraveling Christianity's deepest mysteries. Brace yourself for a captivating book that promises reflection and inspiration. Where the Light Fell by Philip Yancey. Available now.
Welcome back. I'm your host, Wade Franson, created in the image of God. We're here with author and inspirational leader, speaker, helping others find the path that works for them, Philip Yancey. And right before the break, you were about to share how you came out of the valley of disillusionment, where you were, because of those early experiences that we talked about, and the contradictions and hypocrisies that you saw within your religious experience and upbringing, your personal conversion to get re-engaged more fully and perhaps really for the first time with your spiritual journey and the divine.
Yeah, perhaps really for the first time. I ended up at a Christian college, Wade, of all places, and that was not a healthy move because I was sick of it. I became a renegade, and I would do such immature things as sit out in the benches outdoors and read books like Why I Am Not a Christian by Bertrand Russell, and books like that, and try to ask questions in my classes that professors could not answer, and would make them look bad, and just kind of a jerk, looking down on these kind of happy-faced Christians around me. And that went on for, oh my goodness, a couple of years. I stayed in that college. It was easy and it was cheap. And I don't know if
you mentioned that you had experienced poverty, so or your family had. So so that's important that it was cheap to you, but how were you funding it at all? And what was going on with the economic side of your life at that point?
I was funding it mainly through summer jobs. Back in those days, this would have been the late 1960s, I could earn a couple $1,000s over a summer, and that would pay almost all my school bills at this place.
What kind of
now colleges are like $30,000 a year. They weren't back then.
I have a 15-year-old daughter, and we're talking about it. What kind of work were you doing in the summer?
I would drive a catering truck where I would find a place where they're building a new suburb or laying a highway, concrete on a highway or something out there where these kids had no time to go anywhere and get a ice cream.
So this was personal entrepreneurial activity, being your own boss, not working for somebody else?
Well, I mean, they had the truck, I would pay a percentage to them.
Got it. Yeah. So it's kind of like a franchise, almost like a franchise approach.
Yeah, that worked. And even though I had become quite cynical, there were three things. The title of my book is Where the Light Fell, and it comes from a quote from St. Augustine, who says, I could not look at the sun directly, but I could look on that upon which the light fell. And for me, the three things that kind of got to me, because I knew about hypocrisy and I knew about evil, racism, that kind of thing. The things that got to me were three things. One was the beauties of nature. I survived childhood by becoming something of a naturalist and collecting insects and spending most of my time in the woods alone. It was just a very nurturing environment for me. I live in Colorado now, and that's still true years later. So the beauties of nature, classical music. I was raised in a classical music appreciating family, and my brother was this preternaturally talented pianist.
So Bach or Beethoven for you?
Oh, it's got to be Beethoven or Brahms, actually.
Okay.
Schubert, yeah.
Yep.
And then romantic love, which caught me off guard. I wasn't expecting that, but we were attracted not necessarily for the best reasons. She was as unhappy at that school as I was. So, and I was in a prayer meeting where I never prayed. The other people would, and for some reason I just started praying, and I had a vision. It's the only thing like that I've ever had. And I almost hate to tell the story because people will say, "Well, that never happened to me," and that's right. What happens to you doesn't happen to me.
Something else happened to them, and if they're looking for it and they're aware of it, they'll see it. Something else somewhere. God is speaking to us all at all times. I assume you would agree with that.
That's right. And in my prayer, I started talking about the parable, the story of the Good Samaritan. And I said, I know we're supposed to be like Good Samaritans. We were working in a university setting. We're supposed to go down there and care about those people. I don't care if all 10,000 of them go to hell. In fact, I don't care if I go to hell. Well, if you're at a Christian college and you say those things, you know, you expect lightning to fall. And it didn't, but they were very quiet. And then I had this vision where I actually saw what I thought was the Good Samaritan bending down. And here's this person who's been abused, you know, robbed and left by the side of the road, wounded. He's bending down to help this person. And yeah, we're supposed to be these Good Samaritans helping these poor, benighted people out there. And instead, when I looked in the face of the Good Samaritan, it was a depiction of Jesus as I knew him through any kind of art, which probably is not what he looked like, but that's who I recognized. And then I looked at the person in the ditch, and that was me.
Wow.
And I thought I was this sophisticated, smarter than these people. I could see right through them. And the whole time, every time Jesus would lean down, I would spit in his face. And it was a very disturbing, I finally just got up and left the room. Disturbing image. And it kind of exposed me as the neediest one of all. You know, it was easy for me to sit there and judge and look down on people. And it was just, it was a turning point in my life. And I wasn't sure. I remember I wrote my girlfriend at the time and said, I may have had the only authentic religious experience of my life, but I won't know yet. And it changed everything. And eventually I've had a career, you know, as a Christian, spinning words, just trying to struggle with those things that other people are still struggling with, and just looking at them one by one and deciding which things I could keep, which things I should toss away.
Well, I'll share a little bit of my own aha moment like that. And then I want to get into a couple of the topics that you've raised and dive deeper into them. I mentioned being baptized in the horse trough at age 19.
And how cold was that water, Wade?
Well, it was, if I recall, it was in the fall. So it was cold, but it wasn't, you know, it wasn't like the Polar Club where they jump in and go through the ice. But basically, it was a selfish move because, like you, one of the sayings that I credit to myself, because I think I made this up. You never really know, right? Like George Harrison was sued over My Sweet Lord because he had appropriated, what was it? He's So Fine by the Shangri-Las, right? And he said, no, I didn't know that, right? But so I can't. But I attribute this to myself. It's like, if you can't be a good example, you can at least serve as a horrifying warning, right? So, you know, it sounds like your older brother was a little bit like that for you. Well, my mother died when I was 16.
Oh.
And she was an alcoholic. And, you know, so she served as a horrifying warning. And I recognized that I was on that same path. And the baptism was kind of like a desperate, if I do this, then hopefully, thank you, Steve. So, you know, thank you. I want to encourage the audience, but yes, it wasn't the Shangri-Las, it was the chiffons, or maybe it was, maybe we'll see who's right. But that's my vote for now for the best comment of the evening. Thanks, Steve.
Okay.
Anyway, so the point is, it wasn't sincere enough, right? And I didn't, and I continue to struggle with this thing of trying to get involved in church activities, drawing closer to God, and then dipping my foot in Satan's pool, right? Because like your brother, I was dabbling in drugs at that time, anything I could get my hands on, you know, when I was 16, 17, just to numb the pain and the confusion and the horror of what my life was. And, but it was, I think it was like six months after that, I was in a high-speed chase up in Alaska with the state troopers in pursuit, and I ran off the road at 120 miles an hour.
Wow.
And I won't go into the details because no one would believe it anyway. When a miracle like your vision happens to you, it's for you. It's not for anybody else. You know, this whole idea of a testimony. Well, fine, testimonies are fine, but not if everyone's going to discount like a doubting Thomas, and they want to put their own finger in the hole, right? So anyway, it's not for anybody else. So I won't go into details, but I know God saved my life. I should be dead, and he saved my life. But the thing that got through to me was I was not being a good boy. I was not being a good boy when he saved my life. And I had the audacity to tell God at that moment, okay, you've saved my life. You've bought my life. You're now responsible for me. And I am now your son. And I disowned my father, whom I hated, and I won't go into why. It had to do with a kidnapping. He literally kidnapped me and my sisters and smuggled us out of the country, but that's another story. But I said, you're now my father. I'm an orphan. My mother's dead. You're my father. You're responsible. And I gave my life to him in a way that I had not done at baptism, if you follow me. That was my turning point, right? But I wanted to share that because I could have had 100 turning points up to that moment. It took something dramatic. And by the way, I never again thought that God would ever rescue me again. I knew that was a once in a lifetime get out of jail free card, right? You follow me? I didn't. Sure. I mean, could I be wrong about that? Sure, but I decided I'm not taking any chances in being that stupid again. Not that I wasn't that stupid again, but anyway.
Yeah. Well, you ran smack into grace, is what you did.
Absolutely, and I recognize it as grace.
You did not deserve it. Yeah.
Exactly, because the God that I had thought I understood wouldn't have done that.
Right.
He would have let me kill myself in that stupid moment.
Yeah.
Which is, I want to go on a tangent. I want to come back to this whole idea of looking down. Let's start there, and then I'll go on my tangent if I remember. But this attitude of looking down, really, isn't that? Would you agree that is the toxic cancer of any religion? Is elevating oneself, because the mind of Christ in Philippians is to esteem others better than oneself.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that is the toxic sin of evangelicalism. I represent that tribe, so I'll speak for us. And that's why got Jesus so angry about the Pharisees. And if you study Jesus' time and you chose a group of people who were most like Jesus, you would say, well, maybe he was a Pharisee. But look what he said about them. You're a bunch of whitewashed tombs and
Jesus, gentle Jesus, right?
Yeah, right.
Den of vipers, snakes.
Yeah,
you scour heaven and earth to make one disciple, and then you make him twofold the son of hell as yourself, right?
Right.
So
right.
I want to now ask you with the utmost respect, something that occurred to me recently, again, that I've never heard anywhere else. So I want to explore it with somebody who I would, feel would have a really strong, valid opinion on whether there's any truth to this. We all know the Cain and Abel story, right? How Cain was the bad brother and Abel was the good brother, right? It occurred to me recently that in Jesus's effort to reach the Pharisees, he retold the Cain and Abel story. And his retelling of it is the prodigal son. And in that story, Cain is the good son and Abel is the bad son. Does that resonate with you at all? Have you ever looked at the prodigal son?
I've not heard those characters put together like that.
But let me unpack it for the audience, and then you can comment and give you a moment to think about it. So in the Cain and Abel story, Abel was more obedient to the directions of God, and he brought an offering that was in accordance with what God really wanted. And Cain brought an offering that was not really good enough, right, in that sense. And maybe there was or wasn't sincerity, but he thought it was good enough for God, and God was a little bit displeased with him, and it angered him and made him jealous, so he killed his brother, right? But now in the story of the prodigal son, and I forget, I should actually research this. Was it the older or younger? Is it really that literally aligned with Cain and Abel? But in the prodigal son, one son leaves, takes his inheritance and leaves and squanders it on wine, women, and song. And he ends up eating with the pigs in some pigsty. And he says, you know what? The servants in my father's house have it better than me. I will go back and throw myself at my father's feet and say, take me back as a servant. And the good son stayed with the father and was obedient to the father. And so now this bad son comes, and the father sees him afar off. And rather than making him come grovel at his feet and say, well, it's tough out there, isn't it? I'm glad you finally seen the light. No, he runs to his son, gives him a coat, kills the fatted calf, throws a feast. And the good son is jealous and angry and says, you never did that for me. You never. And so now the good son is envious of the bad son. And that's where the Cain and Abel story is flipped. And then the father says, what are you talking about? You're always with me and everything I have is yours. Yeah. And now this son that was lost is coming back. Why wouldn't I celebrate?
Yeah. Well, it is an interesting juxtaposition, and I have no problem with that. I would add one little twist in there, though, and that is, I think both of those stories are really about the Father.
Amen.
God.
Amen.
And when you think about it, I mean, this was
two sides of the Father.
Yeah, the second. Well, two sides. I don't know. In Cain and Abel, the first murder. What should God have done? Well, he let Cain get away with murder.
Absolutely, and he put a mark on him to protect him from anyone else committing the same crime.
And then it's even.
Well, he didn't really let him get away. He banished him. He did separate him.
You're right. But he didn't kill him.
Right. He was merciful, but just.
Yeah. And then in the prodigal son, justice becomes full of grace, and in fact, boy, that's true of so many of Jesus' parables. It's the Good Samaritan, not the good rabbi, and it's
right.
It's this
absolutely
it's the tax collector, not
He's
the Pharisee.
Constantly flipping it on its head because the people of the book have found ways to violate the intentions of the book.
Good way to put it. Yes.
Korban being another example for those in the audience who don't know what that is. It was a way in which they could encourage people, rather than taking care of their family, they could, to your point earlier about knowing when and how to throw the log in the fire in dedication to Jesus, they could celebrate themselves as great religious leaders, donating money to the church, money that was taken away from the people that God said should have it. And the priests sanctioned this giving of wealth to the church rather than taking care of your members of your family, which was what God told them they had to do.
Yeah. Someone just commented in the chat room about the Father. I never looked at it that way. There's a good book by Tim Keller. I don't know if you know that name, Wade. He was a pastor.
Yes, I do. Yep.
He died just last year. And
didn't know that.
A fine preacher right smack in the middle of Manhattan. And he wrote a book called The Prodigal God, which makes that same point.
That's where I'm familiar with him. I think I read that God years ago.
Yeah, he is prodigal with grace, with mercy, with forgiveness. And that's the message we should be getting across.
Wonderful. So I had interrupted you with all of that, but you were talking about your conversion story and beginning down the path of your career of writing books, and how your experiences that we've talked about and the vision that you had now led to you having a genuine experience with that Father, right? In a sense, you were a little bit like the prodigal son at that moment. And he welcomed you back with a little bit of a lesson in the form of this vision.
Yeah. I think a lot of people have to go through a period of correcting their image of God. There's a statement by an old British bishop from the 19th century, I think, who said this: in God, there is no unChrist-likeness at all. Which is a fancy way of saying, if you want to know what God is like, look at Jesus.
Right. But Jesus said as much himself, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father.
Yeah. But if you do that, it turns your perceptions, your instincts about God upside down, as we've been talking.
But it's not the person. It's not the person of Jesus, right? It's where the light fell. It's that thing, right? What did Jesus do? How did he act? How did he treat other people? And what were his parables? And his, one thing that many people don't know is that Jesus explained that his parables were actually meant to confuse, right? So that people would hear it and think they understood, but they wouldn't really understand. And his disciples had to come to him to ask him to explain it to them, right? To share what the meaning was of the parables, because he quoted Isaiah and said, it's for them, it's they hear and don't hear, they see and don't see. But to you it is given. So we have to desire, we have to knock, we have to seek to understand the true meaning. I say this a lot. I say, I don't care what you profess. What you do is a whole lot more telling than what you profess.
Yeah, you're right. And Jesus was just knocking down icons all over the place. He was healing people on the Sabbath. He was touching people with leprosy and other diseases that make them unclean. He was hanging out with prostitutes and tax collectors and sinners.
He was breaking the law.
Yeah,
to show what the spiritual intent of the law had always been.
His first miracle was turning water into a big jug of wine for a party, for a wedding party.
Right.
He just he was full of surprises, and that's in the Where the Light Fell. I tell about how there's a quote that's often attributed to G.K. Chesterton. I don't think he actually initiated it, but he used it a lot. He said something like this: the worst moment for an atheist is when he feels a profound sense of gratitude and has no one to thank. And that's the condition I felt. I was discovering the beauties of the world, the grace all around me, and I wanted to get to know that God.
All
I didn't want to
dressed
know
up
the
and
God
nowhere to go.
that I came from, but that God, the God who created the monarch butterfly, the porcupine out here, things like that. Just it's amazing. We had a huge snowstorm. You probably do too, and overnight, this barren, dry landscape is turned into a work of art. These beautiful snow-covered branches. It's
a work of art that collapsed our chicken coop here.
I'm sorry.
We had to crawl in under there in the snow and the chicken poop to rescue the chickens from the collapsed. Anyway, but yes, it's beautiful, and it also has that side too.
It does. It does.
So we're gonna cut to commercial break, and we're gonna go with a message from one of our sponsors, Something or Other Publishing, and not that anyone will be able to duplicate the 24 books, but everyone I think has a story. Everyone has something that they'd like to share, and one of the sponsors of the show, Something or Other Publishing, has a unique approach to that. Do not go anywhere. We're going to continue this conversation with celebrated Christian author Philip Yancey, author of 24 books selling over 15 million copies. This is just an amazing show, and I'm just so enjoying this conversation. And I hope our audience will stick with us over this short commercial break. We'll be right back to talk more with Philip Yancey.
And welcome to Something or Other Publishing, or as our friends like to call us, Soup. Soup is a platform that connects authors, readers, and service providers in one convenient place. Choose Soup if you're an author with a great book idea and you're looking for a publisher offering hands-on coaching in some of the best royalties in the business. Or if you're a reader who enjoys engaging with celebrated and emerging authors. We already have over 3,000 of them, and more are joining every day. You can even win free books by voting on their book ideas. Or maybe you're a service provider and you're looking to engage with over 3,000 authors. We're here to help. So whether you're an author, a reader, or a service provider, you're in the right place at Soup. Contact us at help@soupllc.com to learn more.
Well, welcome back. Something or Other Publishing is also the company that has the Royal Falcon Press imprint, which publishes religious books and sponsors this show, Created in the Image of God. I'm your host, Wade Franson, and we're here with Philip Yancey. Right before the break, we were talking about Jesus and the parables, and with what led into this was a vision that Philip had that was a transformative experience for him. So tell us, and we're rapidly running out of time, but tell us a little bit about how you got into writing and what has kept you in that field, writing successful book after successful book that is reaching and helping millions of people.
I started with a teenage magazine, and that was a great training ground because it was a religious magazine, and these teenagers would usually get it as a gift of their Aunt Matilda or somebody, you know. And Matilda, concerned about little Johnny, he doesn't seem to like church. I know, I'll send him a Christian magazine. Well, then Johnny gets a magazine. Hey, look at it. It's got my name on it. And they say, it's a Christian magazine. And I've got one sentence to get him to read the next sentence and one page to get him to turn the next page. And I learned.
You got to hone your craft.
I learned I'm not in charge. The reader is in charge. And if I don't somehow give them something that makes them feel it was worth their time, then I'm dead. And so the topics I write about are often addressed by pastors and seminary professors and people like that. I'm not. I'm a journalist, and journalism is about breaking complex things down into simple parts. And I do have to spend a lot of time in the complexity before I come up with the simple parts, but that's what we do. So when you read one of my books, I'm not talking down to you. In fact, I'm writing that book because I don't know the answer and I'm looking for the answer. And so that come together with me and maybe we can figure this thing out. That kind of attitude. I'm just an ordinary pilgrim in the pew sitting next to you. We all have these questions. We wonder these things. Most people think about them maybe on Sunday if they go to church or whatever. But in my case, that's my job. I think about it all day long.
And aside from your reputation, the other reason I really wanted you on this show was a book that you wrote that has that journalistic sort of, headline title that really appealed to me, which is The Jesus I Never Knew. And we were talking about Jesus' parables and how he always surprised people. So tell us a little bit about your journey behind that book, because I know there's a real story for you personally behind it as to why you wrote that book.
I guess it was my way of shaking off the straitjacket of my past. The church I grew up in, it's all about checking the right boxes. I believe this, I believe this, I believe this. And I look at Jesus, things we've been talking about, he's out of the box. Mm-hmm. He never comes up with the answer you would expect, the proper answer. There's an author named Brendan Manning, you may have heard of him, and he went through an account and he said there were 181 times when people came up to Jesus and asked a direct question. And he said 3 times did Jesus give a direct answer. He would usually throw a question back or tell a story or just, confuse the person. And because he didn't need to believe this and that, he wanted you to believe it and work it out for yourself. And just the freedom, I couldn't predict what Jesus was going to say. He was full of surprises. And I wanted my God to be like that. My God had been so predictable, so unattractively predictable.
A little small God that you put in a box.
Exactly.
Just like the idols that, Rachel took with her when Jacob, took her away from Laban. And I don't know if you know that. Anyway, I'm a fundamentalist at heart still. I love all those little stories and their details. She took her father's idols with her when she left.
She sat on them, right?
Yeah, she hid them because the way of women was with her, and no one could question that. And that's how she got away with when her father came after them because his idols had been stolen.
Yeah. Well, see, I'm with you, Wade, because as much as I struggled under fundamentalism growing up, looking back, I took one of these polls I found on the internet about, I was a teenage fundamentalist kind of thing, and I realized that it did some things wrong, but it did some things right. It made me very disciplined. It taught me the Bible.
Let's not throw babies out with bathwater. Yeah. That's not what Jesus was about. He said, you should have tithed on your mint, anise, and cumin and not left the weightier matters undone.
Yeah.
Judgment,
Yeah.
mercy, and faith. He didn't say
That's right.
throw it all out.
That's right. That's right. And so looking back, I have a lot of gratitude. And, you know, I also learned as we started the toxic sin of looking down on other people.
Yeah.
I look back on that little church, and there are a lot of things wrong with it. And we heard the same messages over and over about sin and hell. But when a house burned down, when a woman was left by her alcoholic husband or something, that little church would step in and be the arms of Jesus to them. And that's what we're supposed to be here for, I believe.
Yep. So I want to encourage more comments in the chat like this one. Let's bring in a question from the audience, and then I want to also bring in Dan Sanderson, who's been in the wings here in a few minutes to talk a little bit. And then if I remember, I'm gonna come back to this thing about looking down on people. But here's the comment by Joni. Which book taught you the most about yourself other than the memoir?
Probably a lot of my books have question marks, and the book called What's So Amazing About Grace is the one that taught me about myself, because it's really what we've been talking about. It's that we live in this ranking society where, this is the way you get people to like you. This is the way you get God to like you. And when you do that, just in the example you quoted there, here the Pharisees were tithing their kitchen spices, but they're missing justice. They're, in the church I went to was measuring hair length, make sure men don't wear masks.
Skirt length, makeup application.
Right. Yeah, but it's okay to be racist. It's okay to not care about the poor.
Exactly.
Jesus is saying you got your priorities all
wrong.
Well,
what did Jesus say? You strain at a gnat and swallow a camel.
Yeah, right. That says it. So that collision with grace upset me, and I think it should upset us. And taught me about forgiveness and about going back to my own past, the pastors I grew up with, my mother and others in my family, and just start seeing them through the eyes of grace, and to realize that we are here on earth to be dispensers of God's grace, so that people can look at us and say, oh, that's what God is like. Why would you forgive your enemies? That's crazy. Why would you love your enemies?
Right.
Oh, because God did that. And that's the only way that people are going to know what God is like.
And let me share another little anecdote from my life. And this is a quick anecdote, but it sums up, 40 years of wandering in the wilderness like Moses. And that is your comment about the church that would, help the other people in their church. Jesus. So my first book is called The People of the Sign, and the sign, SIGN, and the sign in that book is the Seventh-day Sabbath. We were a Seventh-day Sabbath keeping church, right? And that was holy time. And because we kept the Sabbath and the annual holy days, we had the law and the testimony of Jesus, right? Revelation chapter 12, the woman coming down from heaven and the remnant of her seed who had the law and the testimony. So we were super special, true Christians in our minds, right? We also knew that we were, the weak and foolish of the world. So that helped hold our arrogance in check. But the thing that we didn't understand at all is that the sign that Jesus gave for his covenant is not the Seventh-day Sabbath at all. That's clear and obvious. So then what is it? What was the sign of the Christian covenant? I came up with an answer that satisfied me, and I don't want to get into covenant theology, and I'm not saying this is a definitive answer, but for me, the sign of the Christian covenant was obviously John 13:35. It took me a long time to come to this conclusion, but once I saw it, it was like a blinding light. By this shall all men know that you are my disciples, that you have love one for another. And you just said your church had that. But what was interesting to me when I realized that was the sign of a true Christian is the degree to which we didn't have it, because all men means an independent, outside, third-party observer. All men doesn't mean all of the people in your fellowship will recognize that you're loving people because you love your own, right? You just mentioned love your enemies. That's expansive, that's explosive. By this shall all men know that you are my disciples, that you have love one for another. So the sign of a true Christian is, do you love everybody? And this led to, through many long and winding roads, a focus on one of my favorite parables. When the Son of Man comes in his glory, he will judge the nations or the peoples, and he will separate them like sheep and goats. And I analyzed this, and I gave a sermon in Estonia to one of the splinter groups of the church that I had resigned from, who welcomed me back, even though I was no longer with their congregation. So I was really working to mend bridges and make peace with all these squabbling fragments of our denomination. But the sermon that I gave was on that parable, and I said, how do we know that we're a sheep, not a goat? Because the sheep and the goats were identical, right? Neither of them recognized Jesus. Your book was The Jesus I Never Knew. They both said, "When did we see you?" So none of them recognized who Jesus was. And he said, well, when you've done it to the least of these, you've done it to me. Done what? Given them a glass of water, visited them in prison. So I said, well, why? How? Because both the sheep and the goats were trying to be good people. And it's not like the goats would never give a glass of water to anybody. They were, of course, doing good deeds and good works like the sheep were. So what was the difference? And for me, again, this isn't meant to be definitive, but for me, the answer was the goats were trying to figure out who was and who wasn't. The goats were trying to distinguish between people, who was in and who was out. The goats never recognized Jesus because they were trying to recognize him. The sheep never recognized him because they didn't care. You follow me?
I do.
The sheep could be seen objectively by an outside observer as loving everybody indiscriminately. The goats were not like that. They were discriminating, right? And that word is interesting. Discriminating. Going back to your comments about racism, they were they were discriminating. That's a two-edged sword of a word.
Yeah.
So now, having just said that, I want to throw out a fun one. We talked about this. So what's the difference then to be discriminating? The difference between a fundamentalist and an evangelical?
Well, let's see. I heard an old definition of fundamentalist that no fun, too much damn, and not very much mental. And then I heard one of an evangelical. An evangelical is kind of like a fundamentalist. They all like Billy Graham. In those days, they did, but they're not nearly as angry. I think the anger and the rigidity are the differences. Evangelicals I know really believe the Bible and want to follow Jesus, and that, I almost don't even use the word anymore, which is a shame. Because it means good news, and somehow,
absolutely,
in most eyes, it's not considered good news anymore.
It's old news, right? It's old news.
Yeah, right.
So, but interesting, it just occurred to me that the fundamentalists are drawn to the Old Testament, but they don't understand the whole picture. The evangelicals are drawn to the New Testament, but they don't understand the whole picture. Yeah, right. Perhaps that's right. And the reason I think it's healthy if we can laugh at each other and our weaknesses and our foibles, right? Not at each other, but with each other. We're not laughing at you, we're laughing with you at you, right? Yeah,
kind of like Garrison Keillor. Remember him, the Prairie Home Companion? The people
absolutely
who enjoyed it most were the people he was gently making fun of, and they loved it.
Right. And, helping ourselves to see ourselves in a mirror, a good-hearted mirror. And of course, the perfect mirror is the Word of God. And that's what I take away from my fundamentalist background, is a respect and an awe for the Word of God.
Good for you.
Which we've been talking a lot about tonight.
Yeah.
So I'm going to go ahead and bring in Dan Sanderson now, unless, Philip, you have anything that you want to add. Here's another great comment from the audience that's, unfortunately, you're not going to win with this comment because we'd rather have you buy the book than us give you one. But thank you. Go grab a copy of Philip's book.
Well, I've already chosen my favorite comment. Looking at
awesome.
Yeah, and it's a
Well,
very
well,
simple one.
hold it a
Okay,
little
hold
bit
on.
because we're
All
going
right.
to bring Dan. And by the way, I should honor us. We're actually at time, but we often go over time. How are you feeling, Philip? Do you want to go on a little bit longer and invite Dan, or are you? I know you're
If we could
perhaps an
keep it to
hour
about
ahead.
10 minutes, yeah.
Perfect, perfect. Well, let's bring Dan in then. And Dan is our philosopher friend. The guests or the viewers know him as our 2023 co-host. Dan is still there. He's in the wings. We've got several shows planned with Dan coming up. But Dan, what questions would you have for Philip and so forth from a philosophical perspective?
I was mulling over this evangelical versus fundamentalist, and I was just sketching out things, so it's not fully formed yet. Something like the fundamentalist has his feet on the ground, and the evangelical hears songs. Like everything's like a symphony of beauty and performance and angels singing and stuff like that. So that's kind of how I would differentiate the two. Is that how does that, as a, if I dare say, a secular believer, how does that sound to you?
Yeah, well, the evangelicals I know are some of the best people at putting their faith into practice. I'm thinking of Gary Haugen, who founded the International Justice Mission. He's a Harvard-trained lawyer, raised Baptist, and he started traveling around the world. He worked for Bishop Tutu in South Africa, and then he founded this organization that started kind of the sexual trafficking mission movement. And there are now several hundreds of lawyers who work for him, thousands around the world. Or Brian Stevenson, who runs the museum down in Montgomery, Alabama. And there was a book and movie about him called Just Mercy. He helped the people on death row. Solid evangelical, came from Eastern College. And those kinds of people, when I hear evangelicals just only associated with politics, all those were people who voted for Donald Trump, I would love to introduce some of those people to the evangelicals who I believe really are living out, trying to be like Jesus. And I know a lot of them, and they really are living out the name Good News.
I would add to that. Thank you. I think that's spot on, and appreciate you calling out those great examples. To me, fundamentalists tend to circle the wagons more, and evangelicals tend to go out more outward looking. Whereas, not to use conservative and liberal; those are such
Right. Well, but I think you're right. One time I was asking myself, why is it that Jesus did prefer to hang around the sinners rather than the Pharisees? The Pharisees he had a lot more in common with, and he could talk with them about all sorts of things. And then what is it that made the Pharisees these unlikable people? And I think the problem with the Pharisees is that they hung around other Pharisees all the time. And so many, that liberal conservative
echo chamber anyone.
Oh, absolutely. And so I say to people, when you're struggling with your faith, don't wait till you get it all figured out intellectually and then go and act on it. Go now. Go to the homeless shelters and go to the soup kitchens and go to the prisons, and it'll rock you, and you'll find grace there, and you will find people who will challenge your faith. And that's really where you talk about being grounded. To me, I think that's the way of being grounded, to get your feet out of the recliner, and go out there and find the real world.
Hey, Philip, so what comes to mind for me is the nuclear family, or the nucleus family. I'm not sure what the proper reference is, but it's centered around the hearth and strong father, strong mother, children. And you mentioned something like going out into the community, into the homeless areas, or into the prison systems. And if you'll pardon my kind of like semi-critique here, is it a little cliche? And what I mean by that is that there's opportunities to be a good person and follow the example of Jesus Christ. There's ways to do that without having to tap into that narrative that is maybe perpetuated by Hollywood, or maybe ends up being on something equivalent to a life's bucket list. And I'm steering the conversation a little bit here, but the upside that I'm thinking is that your sister, an ex-wife, people close to you, people that have been in your life that love you. I mean, I can't think of anything more fundamental to making and affecting change right around you, with your children, the relationships with your parents. What would you say to that, as opposed to trying to, go so to scale so much in society with your goodness?
Well, we all have different callings. My calling is to sit in my office and read books and struggle with the Bible and try to make sense of it and take that message and apply it to other people. I do some things. I support a lot of ministries that do some of the things I wouldn't be very good at. I wouldn't be very good at counseling homeless people, but I can bring them to the fore. Just today, I was writing an article on what's really going on the border with all the migrants coming across. I mean, we hear about the issues, but we lose sight of what it's like for these people to leave their homes, their nations, with nothing but the clothes on their back and on often a false promise of a dream in America. They come, and that's what I can do. I'm not on the border talking with these people one by one or handing out clothing to them, but I can visit, and I can come back and render what I experience in a way so that other people would say, maybe I should go down there. Maybe I should do that. So we all have different callings, and my point there was not to say some things you do are better than other things. My point was, it's important for us to get out of that echo chamber. It's important to be around other people. And there are organizations, Better Angels, groups like that try to get people together who see the world differently. And if you don't do that, you end up with what we've got in the United States today. You've got people who never get around people who think differently. Some of them watch Fox News, some of them watch CNN, and very few watch both. And go ahead.
Yeah, let me jump in there, Philip, and comment on this, because this is near and dear to my heart. A tiny bit of a story. Most of the viewers know. I alluded to it earlier. I was kidnapped as a child in a divorce situation, smuggled out of the country, broken family, lived in a tent in Alaska. Philip also shared his early years of poverty due to the early death of his father. Now, because of that, for me, family is so important, right? And I was blessed with a family later in life, so even more heightened awareness as an older person of my 12-year-old son and my 15-year-old daughter and my lovely wife, Angela, whom I call my angel. However, none of my kids have the experience that I had of being poor, of living in a tent. I've given them privilege. I've given them privilege that I gained from walking a path of faith and love and service and receiving guidance and blessing from God, following his word, making good choices based on the word of God that ultimately paid off for me, even though I came from those difficult circumstances. But my children have none of those experiences. So yes, family, focusing on my family is very important, which was your point. But it's worthless if I don't teach them a little bit of hardship somehow, and pure and undefiled religion, per James 1:27, which is to care for the orphans and widows in their affliction while keeping oneself unspotted from the world. So no, it's not enough to just focus on my family and raise good children, or rather raising good children does require that I teach them about the kinds of things that Philip has been speaking about, if that makes sense. If I just teach them to be good, productive citizens in society, no, that's not nearly enough, in my opinion. With that, we are out of time, and I want to honor Philip's request to keep it to about 10 minutes. So we've had a couple more comments, but Philip, you said you had one that you wanted to pick in terms of your favorite.
Right. There are a number of them, but this one just kind of captured it. And the name there is Planksip. Planksip. And it's very simple.
Oops, I have to disqualify that one, but I will show it because Planksip is our co-host Dan Sanderson.
Oh, okay. Well,
so now we threw you a twist. You got to pick because we're not going to give him a free book.
But let me explain why I like it. It's very simple.
Yes.
He says, "Father like Son," and that was back to my quote. In God is no Christ-likeness at all. If you want to know what God is like, look at Jesus, and that's what we should be too. Father like Son like grandchildren. We as followers of Jesus, our goal in life should be to represent what God is really like. Not the ways we were brought up, not what we heard in these churches that we've been talking about, but the real God. The real God is like Jesus. Jesus is like the real God. And the more we are like Jesus, the more we can demonstrate what the real God is like.
Thank you. And I'm not surprised, actually, that our philosopher friend sort of picked up on that essence and condensed it into a cogent
How about
soundbite.
that? Yeah.
However, I've got to ask you to dig in one more time to some of those comments and see if there's somebody else.
Yeah.
But thank you, Dan, for that summation.
Yeah, you and I guess I would settle out. I didn't write the name down, but I wrote the essence of it. Someone wrote in after you and I talked about some experiences we had. I had a vision and you had, your life was saved. And the person just said, I love visions that you can't forget like that. And
I will find it.
Yeah, and God deals with us in very different ways. And there's no cookie cutter approach. Why would an infinite God do the same thing twice? So everybody in the world is different, and we need different ways of being aware of God's reality. And I think that's what the person was getting at. And yours was different than mine. Mine's different than everybody else's. So don't try to mimic us. Don't think, oh, I didn't have that. You're right. You didn't. You've got your own. I hope you do have your own. And the gospel is clear. If you seek, you will find something. If you listen to that hunger in your heart, God will respond with what Jesus called the living water that gives you life, not death.
Thank you. I've sent an email or a post in the chat to Creative Global Funding Services to claim your free copy of Philip Yancey's memoir, Where the Light Fell.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And you can also, if you didn't win it tonight, you can get it, I'm sure, everywhere books are sold. And Philip, I do hope you've enjoyed this even half as much as I have. And I hope we can maybe interest you in coming back again to explore these topics more deeply.
Well, we didn't cover it all, did we?
I don't know. We only talked really about a couple of your books, and there's so many more. If there's, the memoir obviously is the one we're promoting, but if people have questions, well, this is going to be so hard because, again, you love all your children and grandchildren. I was going to just suggest, based on the show tonight, what one or two books might you recommend that you've written that would be helpful to people to further explore some of the topics that we have covered on this show?
Well, we've mentioned the names, The Jesus I Never Knew and What's So Amazing About Grace. Those two have been most widely distributed. So, let the people decide, and that's what they vote for.
Wonderful, wonderful. Stick with us just one more moment. I want to announce who's going to be on the show next week. Okay. Next week, we have an author, Aleksandar Velchik from Serbia, who has written a book of original history on Admiral Horthy, who was the regent over Hungary. The Hungarian regent over Serbia during World War II. He's a celebrated hero in Hungary with statues, and diverse characters like Roosevelt and Stalin express their admiration. And yet he is also culpable, in the eyes of many, for genocidal war crimes, including the razzia and the murder of hundreds of Serbian Jews and other undesirables and throwing them in a hole in the ice. The book is called Genocide Revealed, and Aleksandar Velchik is on this was one of the first books published by Something or Other Publishing in 2012. And when the UN unveiled its archives in 2015, the material in the book was corroborated with information that had not been revealed. So on the 10-year anniversary of his book and the release of the paperback, he will be on the show next week. We're going to explore a number of issues related to the broader view of the world situation on Created in the Image of God. So you don't want to miss that show. We've got other religious figures coming back after that, but this is a little bit of an anomaly on our show. That's next week. So, Philip, any parting words before we wrap up the show for tonight?
Well, I appreciate what you're doing. I appreciate that you haven't thrown the baby out with the bathwater. You still honor the Bible, get nourishment from it, and I'm the same way. We had to go through a period of shucking off some things that didn't belong in our faith. But everybody who lives at some point faces questions of meaning and why are we here and what kind of people should we be, and some of those basic questions. So the fact that churches sometimes do a bad job answering those questions is not a reason to turn away from them. It's a reason to find better answers.
Well, if we are honored to have you back, sort of that distinction between the individual, the religion, and the faith is something that I'd like to explore further. What are the roles and what should the appropriate balance of our church be versus our individual spiritual life and the community of the faithful and our personal relationship with God, and how do we hold these things in balance and not lose our moral compass? Especially if we belong to a large organization or perhaps a very small organization, religiously. Each one might have its own features, and how do we balance that, and what is right for us in terms of our personal spiritual path? Those would be perhaps questions we might explore in a future episode.
All right.
But Philip, thank you so much, and good night, everyone. We look forward to seeing you here next week, same time, same place. And once again, Philip Yancey, thank you so much for gracing the Created in the Image of God show with your presence this evening.
My privilege. Thank you.
All right. Bye.